this computer. I do have some water right there. All right. If we could just do this little smile first. Okay, and a lot of times I do this. And look at yes, if you do that too, that's great. Awesome. Okay, and then before we begin, and I do this to everybody. I'm going to shake a little bit and get ready. So, Michael, what would you do if I'm doing this? How would you, knowing you're a guitar player as well, imagining you're playing guitar in your head?
When I play guitar on stage, I don't move, I'm focused on the
Seriously.
guitar. Yeah,
Ah.
I let the singer move and the bass player. I'm just sitting
You're
there
just
by
the
myself.
accompaniment, just right now.
That's right.
Okay, let's begin. Eden with Just Be Spiritual Boom. Michael, my guest, please go ahead and say hello as my voice cracks up a little bit.
Hi. Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. And today we are going to talk about his book, Visions of Atlantis, and how he was an atheist before doing this work. So I want to go through that process. He's had quite a day today. So if we can go into that a little bit as well. And this is all about just expanding our minds. If he's willing today, I also want to talk about his Cayenne West story, Whitney Webb, and everything that you're seeing in the world. So let me give my little hello intro myself. So I want to bring up my meditation simplified, demystified Zoom class that I will be having April 13th, 20th, and 27th, which I think is a Thursday from 1 to 2, 2023. So if you feel inclined to learn more, it almost doesn't matter what level that you're at. This will help you get deeper. And I believe in meditation, and I'm including this in the book that I'm writing, that meditation will give you this foundation during this great awakening, which is a very rocky time that we're going through right now. It can also get you closer to God. So whatever your reasoning, I've been doing this for a long time. We will get you going. So register Eden at edenjustbe.com. And also please subscribe to this, whether you're watching it on YouTube or Rumble or BitChute, or if you're listening to it on Apple Podcasts, Zoom Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts. I'm like on 17 podcasts. And if you can't, just subscribe to all of them. Just anything to help this work and to become connected to all of this, greatly appreciated. Now, I'm going to go into a bio. So Michael Le Flem, please tell me I said that right.
Close enough. Le
Oh,
Flem.
Le Flem. Currently, MA, who's currently in Mexico, is a researcher, adjunct professor of history and philosophy, columnist for New Dawn magazine and kennedysandking.com, as well as a scuba diver and guitarist. He grew up in South Florida, attended the Harriet L. Wilkes Honors College and Florida State University, where he studied Western intellectual history and U.S. foreign policy. Visions of Atlantis, Reclaiming Our Lost Ancient Legacy is his second book, and which accompanied his 2008, The Spectre of Reason. He is a book reviewer for Publishers Weekly and was a one-time research assistant for investigative journalist Whitney Webb, which I'm going to talk about her just for a second if you don't know who she is, while she was writing her best-selling two-part series, One Nation Under Blackmail. He has also ghostwritten for authors of the History Press. So let me give a little nod to Whitney before we begin. So she is now in her early 30s. She has been a professional writer, researcher, and journalist since only 2016. This girl is wise beyond her years, which I think Michael is as well. She has been delivering in her book and in interviews groundbreaking stuff on Epstein, the Clintons, the Clinton Foundation, the WHO, transhumanism, AI, etc. She was on, I just watched this interview that she was on with Glenn Beck. And Glenn Beck is an American conservative political commentator as well. He's been doing this for 45 years. And he said his interview, this hour interview with her, was the most important interview that he's ever done. So he asked her, and he basically said, you, Whitney, are a massive threat to very powerful people. How do you feel about that? And I'm going to paraphrase what she said because this is so fitting with this podcast as well. This is an energetic and spiritual battle that we are facing. So if you are afraid of these people if you're afraid of them, you're giving them your power. So don't do that. The only way to win is to have the commitment to what you're fighting. And basically, she is fighting the goodness and humanity. Do you mind, Michael, starting off with that? How did you get linked to her? How did this become?
Oh, that's a great question. At the time, I was living in Chicago, where I had lived for about 13 years. And I was working on a project, the restoration of the Avalon Regal Theater in the south side of Chicago, which I had been doing for 7 years, basically as a volunteer, not really
So,
receiving any pay.
can you describe the theater? What was it? Is it an icon kind of theater? Give us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, it's definitely worth Googling. It's one of the most beautiful theaters. It was a Moorish revivalist theater built in, I believe, 1923, maybe 26. It was completed. So almost 100 years old. And I had met the gentleman, about 8 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe now, who had purchased it. He was the same age as me. And, I'm 38 now. So he was young. He was like 29. I was 29. And we had started working on this, trying to raise money for it. We met the governor, the mayor, everybody, every private equity investor. That was pretty much my job for, 6 years, meeting people in Soho House and schmoozing them and things like this. And this went on for 7 years while I was a professor. And, it was also concurrent with my research on this topic, which I just did for fun in my free time. And lo and behold, at the seventh year, at the 11th hour, when we really had given up hope, we had exhausted all hope. How are we going to get $1 million? Nobody wants to help us. Found out that Kanye West was coming to town during his, he was recording at the time with Chance the Rapper, and he was right about to release the Jesus is King album. And he was in a kind of very philanthropic mode at the time, multi-billionaire. And we had just seen articles like Kanye's in town, and we started doing a little recon, and we discovered that his studio was right down the street. There was a
Oh
secret
my
studio.
gosh.
Yeah, it was like 2 blocks away. So we'd go and we'd circle it, and how do we get in there? We got to talk to him. And the security would always, keep, who are these two people that keep coming over here in suits and everything? And eventually, we really have no idea, but a friend of a friend of a friend must have told him about the project. And one day we wake up to a tweet that said, I'm going to restore the Regal Theater. And I thought it was fake. I thought my friend was playing a joke, but it turned out to be real. And within 2 weeks, you could check this picture on Google. Um, Somebody took a beautiful picture of me and the alderman, and we're meeting Kanye West. He appears like, Great Gatsby out of a caravan of cars with his security commandos surrounding him. And I sat down with him in a room for 2 hours, and we left the meeting with a contract for $1 million commitment. And, he dispersed the commitment in parts. We got the first payment. Everything was good. I finally had some, gas to start restoring the theater, got my team together. And within a year, I discovered that my boss had stolen all of the money. And he showed up at my house, coked up, drunk, with a Lamborghini that he had bought in Miami, and was acting extremely erratic. And when I questioned him about where the money was, he refused to answer, got very aggressive with me in my own apartment. And so at that point, I had to call my attorney. And basically, that was it.
Wow.
2 weeks later, the greatest scam ever perpetuated on humanity began, the COVID-19 psychological war. So that was a nice double whammy. That lasted for, March. I think the city locked down, so I couldn't find another job. And, got my little stimulus check, whatever. Then the next stage, let's see, the National Guard was called because people were burning and looting my city down because George Floyd. So that was nice. I remember being turned back from 7-Eleven at night when I went to buy cigarettes because a National Guard, checkpoint team with a 50 caliber machine gun on a Humvee was turning me around. And at this point, I really started to wonder, like what is really going on here? And it was then that I started looking for work online, and I messaged Whitney Webb on Facebook, actually cold call. And I'd always been a fan of her work, and she said, "I'm working on this book. I'm not really sure where it's going, but I need some help. And I've seen your work at Kennedy's and King. You're an expert on CIA overthrows, and I need some information on the merging of the mafia and the CIA and how that tied into blackmail because they learned all their dirty tricks from the mafia." And so I gave her help with that chapter, and I gave her a little bit of advice on how to reframe Watergate. And then she had me interview actually one of the most famous like child trafficking detectives from the 70s. And that was a really difficult call because what he told me in that call for 3 hours that I had to record was beyond disturbing, really, this world of what people do to children. And so I did that for a few months. That got me through the summer. And then
So within that, did
Mhm.
you already knew the the truth of things? I get like for me, I know the truth, yet every week there's something that's added to
Right,
that. Did
right.
that call just add more to you in terms of
Yeah,
what you already knew?
absolutely. Yeah, going into the book, I was already aware of this whole game, how this works, how blackmail works. And I think that's kind of why we work together so well,
Hmm.
because I didn't have to catch up on a lot. I was just interested in um, trying to get as many details that had not been written about, about these early years of how the OSS and the CIA merged and how that tied into later political blackmail operations. And, she was a tremendously, as you said, gifted researcher, and such a nice person, to work
She's
with.
she seems to be that way. She seems like a very like authentic, like when
Mhm.
Glenn Beck said these amazing things to her, she bowed her head and just said thank you versus, oh, thanks so much. So that's so
No,
good to
yeah.
hear as well.
She's a wonderful person, and, would always tell me, and it was so funny because when I saw that Glenn Beck interview and I saw that she had written the number one crime category book on Amazon, and it's remained in number one. And I'll never forget because in 2020 in July, she didn't even have, I don't think, a title for it. She didn't know it was going to be two books. It was just this thing, and I didn't know what it was going to be. And it was her first book, and I didn't have a book. And so it was such a spectacular, finish line, photo finish when she published her book in, I think, September of last year. And then I came out, boom, December. And I sent her a message like,
Oh,
we made it, I'm trying
oh.
to, I'm catching up. I haven't made it to Glenn Beck yet or Joe Rogan, but I was so
Well,
proud of her.
you're here. Come on.
Right.
Is
I
this
was so
chopped liver or what?
No, of course not. I was so proud of her, like she did it because I knew she was doing it all on her own. She didn't have a support team. And I know at the time, I think she was, living in a pretty remote village in South America and, was raising basically a family by herself, I think at the time. So
Mm.
really a lot of respect for that woman, the real deal. And, one Whitney Webb is worth, 50 reporters at Fox,
Oh
who
my
are
gosh.
honest if you can find them. She's
Right.
like one woman army. And so I thought that was really cool. And then
So, hey,
that
that's
was,
very cool. Look at you.
yeah.
These big stories right off the bat. Okay, proceed, please.
Well, and then at the end of well, then 2021 kicks in, and I start to see that, the Borg who live in my building are all kind of on the same program. And I never did anything they told me. I was the only person in a building of 300 that basically walked around trying to explain what was going on to people,
Yeah.
trying to explain what the World Economic Forum was, trying to explain what all of this is, but it was terrifying because it really was like talking to a bored collective who had fallen into a mass psychosis. And eventually, because I was the only person in the building who never wore a mask. They actually, I had to go to court. They threatened, they cited me with endangering the public safety of my building. And they hit me with a very weird technicality that under these mandates was quasi legal. And in fact, they kicked me out of my apartment, which I had lived in for 3 years, because I did not wear a mask. And I still have the paper that cites that. And
Wow.
so at that point, I basically said, you know, you can't stay here and fight these people. There's nothing to do. I don't even want to be around these people. And I'm going to go crazy. So I talked to the door guy one night, just, you know, in frustration, who was my friend, and I had a concierge. And I was like, you know, he understood all of this. It was fascinating. He was the only person that absolutely, and we would sit up, talk all night about the Whitney Webb book and this, and he was always asking me these questions like, you know, who do you think killed this? Who do you think killed it? What about this overthrow? What do you really think is going on? And they fired him because he was talking to me. And
Oh,
so we
man.
both lost our jobs and our, you know, everything. And so he invited me to live with him for a month until I figured it out. And so I stayed in his spare room, and he had a friend in northern Mexico that had this beautiful nature retreat. And he said,
Yeah.
look, just go down there. You got a couple $1,000s left in your checking account. It'll go a lot further there. And you can learn Spanish quickly. Just get on the airplane, like buy the ticket right now, just one way, go for it. And so that's what I did. And I got on the airplane. I didn't speak, you know, any Spanish. I had only studied Spanish in high school for, you know, like everybody in Florida, you know, studying Spanish. And so, you know, here I am 20 something years later, and I pull out my conjugation tables on the airplane. I somehow get to, you know, northern Mexico on a multi-leg flight. Have no idea what's going to happen. I got $1,000 in my checking account, and you know, just showed up in some remote ranch in the mountains and started learning Spanish. And like within, you know, 2, 3 months, I learned enough that I could start teaching people English, you know, in Spanish. And then that really accelerated my learning until, you know, I'm nearly fluent now, you know, a year or so later. So that was cool. And in that process, I took all the notes that I had collected from the Chicago experience and thought to myself, well, you know, you've got this time down here in the mountains. Why don't you try to put this into a coherent story? Because it's just a series of, you know, notes you've taken in Word notepad files for the last 7 years, with, you know, hundreds of references and bookmarked pages on your browser.
Okay. And this is specifically about Atlantis.
Yeah, and
Okay.
so that's where the book started to take shape. And like I think I had written maybe 40 pages over the last 7 years, just, you know, for fun. And so I started writing it more while I was here. And at one point, um, I was moving some stuff and my monitor broke. And so I think around page 100, my monitor broke. And I said, well, you know, I guess that's it. I guess the book's done. I'm not going to finish it because I can't afford a monitor. I'm just living on, you know, $6 a day. And so I said, no, you know, you have your phone and you can't add references. You're just going to have to manually put these in later. And so I wrote the last, you know, 279 pages on my phone. And, you know, that was not easy,
No.
um, because I think it's the best thing I've ever written in my life. And so it's funny that I did it on my phone. In fact, I look back and I can't believe it because it took, I mean, it took so long to write on the phone in terms of just the physical, technical speed of typing with
Mm.
two thumbs on, you know, on my phone here. And so I did it, and then I put it in a laptop. Finally, some friend of mine gave me a laptop just out of courtesy. He believed in me. In fact, he was the first person in Mexico to buy the book.
Oh,
Nice guy. And so he gave me this laptop, and I put it in the laptop, and I had not seen it in the laptop in a year. So I didn't even think of it like a book because it doesn't feel like a book when you're reading on your phone.
Right.
And I read it for the first time and I was like, this is a spectacular book. Wow, who wrote this? Where did this come from?
Yes, and where did this come from? Exactly.
So,
Wow.
and then I added the pictures, it's got about 95 pictures in there. And I added the references, got 400 references, and I think it topped out at 397 pages. And I published it on the first week of December in paperback and hardcover. And then the Kindle followed. And then I just finished the audiobook, which to my surprise went to #1 Audible release in ancient Egyptian history 2 days ago. So
Well,
there you
that
go.
is fabulous. Okay, what an interesting story. Okay, coming from your knowledge of this, because there are a lot of really evil, terrible things for, yeah, that's what it is happening in the world, and the mob and all these blackmailing and everything
Sure.
that goes into everything. Okay, so you had that basis,
Mhm.
then going into writing about Atlantis, being okay, tell me if I have this right, being an atheist. So what turned that belief in you into something else, and where are you now?
I'm in an Airbnb surviving.
Spiritually, where are you now? But yeah, you had a difficult morning this morning
Mm,
too. Like we had scheduled a podcast for earlier, but then there was some
right.
problem with the Airbnb, and you essentially told me, if this is okay to say, that I might not be
Yeah.
here this afternoon. Yeah, so tell me what's going on with
Right.
that first. And I so appreciate you being here and telling us this story while you're going through all of
Sure.
that rigmarole.
Yeah, well, there's a huge music festival here this week, and I had only reserved, with my friend up. I had been reserving week by week, and so he told me yesterday, last midnight, hey, actually, this place is booked for the next, 8 days. So, and then when you went to go check, like what else is available,
Yeah.
uh, everything is literally 10 times the price, like a place that
Oh,
usually $15 is like $175 a night.
right.
So I've just had to call some friends like, hey, I'm not spending like $1,000, which is,
Right.
3 months of rent here in Mexico to live for 5 days in the same city. So I was just kind of scrambling for that, but I figured it out, I think. So I won't be in
Oh.
a box tonight. But, you know, it's just the way it is. I think I don't know. It is an unbelievable story, and it's why I don't really tell it because I can recall many times being, on dates or things like that, and a woman will ask me, "What are you doing here in Mexico? Do you really want to know? I mean, you're not going to believe it
Right.
if I tell you." So, I mean, I don't know. Things happened in Chicago, and I'm a writer, I guess is the official short bio. But it is interesting to tell it to you, because it's not something I like to really even dwell on anymore,
Mhm.
and I think it's something that, um, going forward, it's kind of like I'm not afraid of anything because, it's not like that was even the hardest thing I've ever had to go through. I've had to go through things much more difficult even than that betrayal and the failure of the project and this and that.
Yeah.
And, I think about what some of the Stoics had to go through and, Epictetus's story or, people alive today who are enslaved in Libya. It's like, I'm not going through anything really that difficult. It's just an inconvenience that will pass. And look what came out of it. Because I think if I hadn't been forced into a situation where, you know, I thought of the book as not just a hobby, but like, look, this is an actual vehicle to launch a second career as a writer, not just as a columnist for these magazines where I generally don't get paid. I get a free magazine or something like
Oh.
that. But, because there's no real market anymore for writers. It's not like 30 years ago where you write an article for the New York Times or New York Magazine, they pay you $1,000. It's like you get a free subscription for the year if you write
Right.
for these. So, but with a book, it is a viable career path, and I was quite shocked to see, hundreds have sold since I published it, and I got letters from people all over the world, in Sweden, France, New Zealand, like, and it's just unbelievable to me because I saw a review the other day that was like, I thought it was for somebody else's book or something. I was just like, who is this person? Like I couldn't believe that this person had written this review. And she was an incredibly intelligent, talented researcher herself, Atlantis researcher. And I never met her. I didn't pay her for the review. And, I ended up becoming friends with her. And she asked me, like, what is the story? And I said, well, this is what happened. And she's like, I can't believe that. She's like, this is the best book I've ever read in my entire life. And I
Oh,
said, well, that means a lot, and then I got a second compliment from a famous Canadian director, and I was just searching the book on Google. He said, this is the best history book I have ever read in my life. And I'm like, well, I'm a very modest person and I've written a lot of things, and I wouldn't say that my first book that I wrote when I was 20 years old it's good, but it's like, it's a very technical, examination of like a very specific window of time in the 20th century, because it was my graduate school thesis that I converted into a book. But this really, I think I wrote for myself, more than anything. And I think that's why it has such, nice reception, is because, of the hundreds of books I've read on this subject, I really was trying to do something different, because I think a lot of people had been approaching it from, the wrong direction. Like, I'm gonna prove it's here. I'm gonna prove Atlantis is here. No, you're wrong. And at the same time, the people that were working on clairvoyant accounts of this subject were basically just presuming that the whole world necessarily believed in remote viewing and clairvoyance. And so, even though there is absolutely incontrovertible evidence that this is the case, that this phenomenon is real and has been used by the government and has obviously been used by Edgar Cayce and other people, my job was to show the materialists this quote unquote science behind it. And then my job was also to show the clairvoyants how their clairvoyant information actually aligned with oceanographic, archaeological, cultural, linguistic, you know, evidence, and bridge the two. And in doing so, basically show that this story is real. And how much we can say about it, well, you'll have to read the book. But I was quite shocked at how much information, for example, from an Edgar Cayce reading or a Barbara Hand Clow reading or a Frederick Oliver reading, lined up almost to an inconceivably accurate degree with modern archaeological discoveries or linguistic similarities that I found between languages that should not exist, um, or just common sense, And in a weird way, I think I might have been one of the only people that could have done that because of my training as an intellectual historian, which was to say that, I've studied the history of philosophy in a historical context. And so the book is kind of like an intellectual history of Atlantis because it's chronological, starts from pre-Platonic sources and it goes to the 20th century. And so you get to see not just how the story itself evolved with the time, like how all history evolves, but you got to see that in different, eras of humanity, different discoveries were made, and that necessarily changed the story. And so this kind of, archaic remote topic becomes actually like a very important thing that informs the present. And in fact, now as a teacher, I can't really ignore it because it actually is the missing piece that explains, like, I don't know, the emergence of civilization simultaneously, after the Neolithic Revolution, or I don't know, monotheistic religions and all their similarities, like, or I don't know, the characters you call Jesus and Buddha and Zen and Zoroaster and how those things are involved in Atlantis, as reincarnated entities. And so it for me was this kind of just absolutely, sensible thing. It was actually, that's what's so funny to me when people say you believe in that, and I'm like, well, let's take the official
right.
story and you explain that to me, because that makes no sense. You're
Mm-hmm.
telling me that modern humans anatomically have existed since at least 300,000 BC, and yet nothing was done for the first 290,000 years. That makes little sense, because in the last 250 years, we've gone from horse and buggy to, Falcon rocket. So by your own logic, how did nothing take place if by anthropologists' own admission, we've had the same or greater brain capacity for 300,000 years? oh, perhaps this thing that you think is fake existed and was wiped off the earth in numerous multiple cataclysms, man-made and natural. Oh, that actually makes sense, but you don't like that because you've staked your career on this absolutely
Yes.
ridiculous fairy tale of
Yes.
the sudden simultaneous emergence of civilization in the Neolithic Revolution.
And there are so many people when you talk about that have based their careers, their jobs on so many things that are not real. And what I love about having Michael on the show too, because I have a lot of spiritually based people, and not to say that you're not spiritually based, but you're very intellectual as well. Part of this thing is too, like with Whitney, we are proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that these things that you guys don't want to believe, they are
Right.
true. And Atlantis is one of these. What was one of your biggest discoveries? Is that a Yeah, let me
Sure.
start with that question.
Wow. Well,
And let me interrupt you just for a second. Y'all, buy his book. Again, support this man who was in Mexico, who had these big things happen to him in Chicago. Just give him some love. Buy his book. Okay. And when you came on this morning, knowing that you were having a little bit of struggle and
yeah,
basically saying, I don't know how happy I guess I'm going to be for this podcast. I'm like, come on, we'll
yeah.
just ramp it all up. This is good. So please continue. Okay.
You
Your
know,
one
it's
of your
funny.
biggest discoveries. Yes.
It's funny. It's better not to be happy, I find, in interviews. You actually deliver. If you're happy and you've had a great day and everything, it's a really lame interview, I've found. So it's actually better to be a little bit on
There
edge.
you go.
Well,
Okay.
one of my biggest discoveries for me was this recurring date of 10,500 BC,
Hmm.
and how important that was across, not just the work of people like, Graham Hancock, or Robert Schoch or Robert Bauval, who all at this point, I mean, it's amazing to me, how the media has basically run a hit job on Hancock after this ancient apocalypse. And it's hilarious to me because before this was even announced, I published a book and or I'm sorry, I finished the book and submitted it, and then
Yeah.
the book was published, and then I think it was like a week or two within him releasing this Netflix series, basically on a ancient high civilization that existed, during the Ice Age. And so it was amazing to me because everything, I had a whole chapter on all the attacks against alternative archaeologists and how weak these attacks were. And so when the media came out and basically said, this is the most dangerous documentary and hey, he's a racist and all this, I mean, it was like, I
Yeah.
was just started laughing because I thought people are going to think I rewrote the book after the series came out, but I had been reading critiques of him from like 2012, 2095, when people were like fingerprints of the gods, this kook and all this. But in fact, everything he said basically has been validated, by archaeology. And this 10,500 BC date is very important because it does appear from numerous sources that something happened, whether it was like a solar event, like Robert Schoch suggests, or perhaps a comet impact, or something cataclysmic certainly took place around that time and precipitated a global flood, global conflagration, shifting of land masses, mass extinctions. And it's fascinating because before any of that was even proposed, that's exactly the date Edgar Cayce gives for the mass migration from Atlantis to Giza, which was one of the three places he says they went. And then you do some more research and you find out, like, okay, well, when, the research of Robert Bauval, like the three peer, and again, people always say, they'll find the funniest things to not make this happen and not
Hmm.
be true.
Hmm.
But I mean, Robert Bauval, in my estimation, has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that the three pyramids are aligned, to the constellation Orion, a sacred constellation to the ancient Egyptians, at the year 10,450 roughly BC. And then, Casey's own date for the construction of the pyramids, which he gave in the year like 1932,
Hmm.
before any of these people wrote anything. He was not an Egyptologist. He never studied these subjects at all. And he said the same thing. He said it was 100 years in construction, begun in 10,490, finished in 10,390. And it's like this went on and on and on and on. And it also led me just to really look into other things he said to see, like, all right, you know, what did he say about, the Nile River, and his thing was, well, it used to be called the Nile River, and it actually emptied into the Atlantic side of the continent of Africa near the Congo Basin. And then it's like you find out that in 1986, a space shuttle satellite imaging radar determined that there was a giant river system that started at the Nile that emptied, at the Congo end of Africa. And it's like,
Wow.
when I show these things to people, it's like, yeah, it's real, just like when Ingo Swann remote viewed rings around Jupiter before they were confirmed in the 70s, like
Mhm.
working for the CIA. Like, that's not fake, like they really did use remote viewers to fight the Russians, and the Soviets were using remote viewers. It's like, just because you don't believe in non-material science does not mean that the governments of the world don't believe in it, and it's real. It's just very rare, and it's a very difficult skill to master. And it's not something they want you to know about, because at the end of the day, you're a slave and they want you to be limited. So it's like, why do you think they would tell you that? Why would they
Right.
tell you anything about Atlantis, for example? Because then, they'd have to go rewrite every college textbook. They'd have to basically retract all the Egyptology degrees from every major university that tell you that Khufu built it as a tomb, even though there's literally no evidence of that. And that's a fairy tale from the 19th century, from Howard Vyse, a soul explorer, finding a piece of graffiti that he himself could have made that says Khufu, but there's literally no record in Egypt, extant record, that explains the construction of the Great Pyramid. So that's odd to me as well, which is not that odd when you think, well, it was there a lot longer than dynastic Egypt. So that record was probably lost, or it was lost in the three destructions of the Library of Alexandria, you know, which is another chapter of the book, like how important that was when millions of documents were stolen and burned by three different groups of people, And so the book really evolved into, like, yeah, it's about Atlantis. Of course, it's a very technical study of Atlantis, but it's also a study of, like, what can we know about history, really,
Mhm.
and who keeps the record, and how does this
Yep.
change with the times, because it's fascinating. Like, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, major newspapers up to the early 90s would talk about this subject with an open mind, you know? Like, I cited a Washington Post article from 1986 called The Misty Fragments of Atlantis. And it's about a travel reporter who goes to the Azores to just write about, like, bars and tourism and hot springs.
Mhm.
And his tour guide is telling him, hey, have you ever read, this dialogue of Plato in the cab? And he goes, until we got in this argument, this guy was my friend. But he said, when that guy in the Azores said, uh, started talking about Atlantis, and I was like, oh, you believe in Atlantis? He's like, that guy sat me down at a bar and grilled me for 2 hours and was citing Plato, in 1986 from his book. And he goes, everyone in the Azores knows that these were the peaks of Atlantis, And the Washington Post published a very fair, open discussion about it, which, as I tracked in the third chapter of the book, I guess the message was disseminated sometime, after the Hancock revelations of the 90s and into the early 2000s and beyond, when this absolutely ridiculous debunking community emerged, who are not debunking anything except, their own intelligence and erudition. When these things started to come out in 2005, I was shocked at how absolutely skewed the debate was, and how they basically used very clever weaponized propaganda linguistics to essentially just say, like, well, this researcher we're interviewing, he discovered Atlantis when he watched a Donald Duck cartoon when he was young, and so everything you read after that, if you don't know anything about it, is like, oh, like, these people are crazy. Oh, okay. But they won't show you, you know, the pyramid, at the bottom of the ocean off the Azores that was discovered and broadcast on Portuguese TV with a picture from the depth finder. Like, they won't show you that. They won't show you the pyramid and temple complex discovered off the coast of Cuba, after September 11th. They won't show you that. They won't show you an honest interview with, me or Graham Hancock or anybody else, or hundreds of other Atlantis researchers. No, they'll show you, Robert Ballard, who I always tell people, yeah, big deal. Like, you accidentally discovered the Titanic. Congratulations. Like, that's not a huge achievement to me. And it's not a huge achievement when he said on record, no Nobel laureate has ever discovered, Atlantis or talked about it seriously. And I said, no, you're right. No Nobel laureate has, just Plato, just.
Oh, geez. Right.
Right. Yeah. But I guess he doesn't count, right? And it's amazing because the obsession with cherry picking data has been really fascinating to watch.
Mhm.
And occasionally I will step into the arena on Reddit or Twitter and just, I'll read people's comments and I say, hey, have you ever thought about this? Or, if you're interested in this, maybe I'll give you a sample chapter of the book or something, or an audio book for free, promo code. And it's incredible how many people are absolutely obsessed with telling you that Plato's date of 9,600 BC, which is explicitly stated in every translation, is fake, and that it couldn't be, and that he added a zero, or the way he counted time was not correct. And it's like, well, that's interesting because he picked the date, of the end of the Younger Dryas period, when a final catastrophe basically, ended that age and began the Holocene age. And he wrote that in 360 BC. So how did he, even if he's wrong, how did he know at that time that that was a cataclysmic, environmental event? I actually think it lends evidence. I just think you're angry because you're stuck in this mode of like, we're gonna go scuba diving and find a circular city with,
Right.
golden arches perfectly intact that says like, welcome to
To
Atlantis. And it's like,
Atlantis.
yeah. And it's like, look, what more do you want? Like, the pyramids are still standing. Even if you
Mhm.
take the accepted date, it's like that's an inexplicable thing that we cannot recreate today. And we don't understand it. And, you know, that's not enough for you. Like, what do you want? And then the pyramids all over the world, Tiwanaku, Pumapunku, like the megalithic high civilized, and then Gobekli Tepe, which has been definitively dated to 10,500 BC. Again, itself, it's like, we're just going to ignore that. Like, that's not a big deal. Um, and it's amazing to me because I always tell people, like, what's the big deal, man? Like, what's the big deal? Just admit, hey, we got to push the date back a couple thousand years. Like, what's the big deal? And I think at the end of the book, I came to the conclusion that it's the arrogance of the current culture. It actually is nothing to do. In fact, this was the most interesting part of the book to me, was as the preponderance of evidence went in the favor that this was real,
Yeah.
the arrogance and hedonism of society increased in equal measure and almost superseded and occluded the actual evidence. Because I looked at it, my final conclusion in a way was that the arrogance that we are the best, Western society will never fail, the banks will never fail, the rockets, like, we've got the best technology, that really, like, because if you engage with, say, the Edgar Cayce readings, the Barbara Hand Clow readings, the Frederick Oliver readings from the 19th century, they all point to a super advanced, Star Wars level of technology. And I really do think, in my estimation, that that's the main reason that people don't want to believe in this, because then they go, well, we ain't all that, because we're driving around in cars using 19th century internal combustion technology, and you're telling me they had crystals and, monorail systems and submarines and airplanes that could go underwater and in the air. And it's like, yeah, they did, and they blew themselves up in one case, and then a comet came, and then this happened, and like, that's gonna happen again probably, but you don't like that because you're gonna lose TikTok and, your delusion. So I think that's a big part that nobody really talks about, is like, the cultural constraints on
Right.
the evidence are
Mhm.
just as valid as, like, it doesn't matter. Like, we could go right now, you and I could go scuba diving in the Azores, and let's say we found something that said, built in Atlantis 10,500 BC. It doesn't matter. No amount. It's like with Whitney's material. No amount of evidence matters when you just go, I don't want to hear about that. That's creepy. I don't want to.
Okay, so let's go into that
I
for you, considering now you are, like, I consider myself to be on the fray. You're on the fray too because you worked with Whitney. You see everything you were at Chicago, everything that happened, and now as an intellectual, you also know that Atlantis was real. How are you going to move forward with your life again? With like minds like me going, yeah, I totally understand. I'm there with you, because also this mind-blowing aspect about everything is because I also believe there is even more to the mob, and like this is kind of a when you talk about Atlantis, like all of this is real. I
It
mean,
is.
ascended beings, it's just, and
It is.
and to get people to open up to that, it's so hard because also we've been programmed to think that we are small and we need to be this when there's all of this. So how,
Right.
with your voice, me having a voice too, how are you going to move forward? Maybe that's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I always tell people, I think I'm a better writer than speaker or, influencer in terms of that mode of communication. I'm very kind of, I'm not an extroverted person, as I'm sure is evident. But, I really end the book on a quite positive message, and I always tell people like, yeah, you can think about the fall of Atlantis and the dark forces from the Ahrimanic deception that was present then, that's present now, and it's like, that's fine, you should be aware of it. It's
Mhm.
real, it's absolutely real, however you want to define it, if it's reptilian or archontic or this or that, it's
Right.
like, doesn't matter, it's there and it's evil and it's in your face. But to me it's more like, I think everybody just has to figure it out on their own, because I can remember when, probably 10 years ago, if a student asked me about Atlantis or something, I would say, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's probably just a myth from Plato. And if I from the future came back like a crazy person, like, no, Michael, look at this, look at that, look at these channeled messages, I'd be like, oh, like, you believe in channeling? Like, do you believe in tarot as well? Because I just wasn't ready to
Right.
engage with, because that process to get there, it ain't for everybody, you
And it
know?
also isn't being an intellectual. I say it's not intellectual because it's not proven. There's no, because it's just,
Exactly.
how can this be? Because I'm in that world too. And to
That's
me, it
right.
just is.
Well, and the thing is, it's like, I mean, even like, take what I just said, like,
Yeah.
because people always like when it's a government study, as if that gives it more credibility,
Oh gosh.
But like, look at the work of like Dean Radin at Stanford, who's doing a great job bridging, with his book Real Magic, and he recently went on a podcast. And I'll cold call after getting that money from Kanye. I'll cold call anyone. I'll cold call the Xi Jinping if I need to get to him. I don't have any fear of sending somebody a crazy message on LinkedIn. And I sent Dean Radin a message when I published the book, and I said, Dean, thank you, because I really like your book, Real Magic, was so cool to me as an atheist, because I saw that this kind of clairvoyance and if you want to call it paranormal, parapsychological, I guess is the technical term, phenomena is real. And it's not just real, it's measurable. And you've got a whole
It is
institute
measurable.
there. Yeah, and you've got a whole institute that's doing things. And you're trying to connect to idiots like me who are still stuck in this very rational, materialistic world. And like, that was the bridge for me. And so he was funny. He sent me a thumbs up emoji, which from a guy like him, PhD, head of the Department of Noetic Research, I was like, I'll take that. But I did, after that, I started getting involved, and I go to the bookstore and read, like, all of the books from the 70s and 80s and remote viewing and case
Mhm.
studies. And I mean, that's as scientific as any experiment, because they put people in controlled situations like a Faraday cage, they give them an anonymous
Yep.
target, and then that person recreates it. And it's like, that proves, like, that's not like, oh, I don't know. It's like the dude saw rings around a planet, and then
Mhm.
you see those through a telescope. Like, what more do you want? And when you the reason I think I was so selective in the types of clairvoyant evidence I used was because I know that there's a lot of people even today who could have gone and just copied the Cayce readings and said, "Oh, I channeled this and I
Mm.
saw the circular city too." And and it's like I
Hmm.
didn't want people to say to me, "Well, you're just using channelers for modern time." So I picked channelers starting with a kid in 1886 who's talking about literally the Star Wars universe, in the wild west of Oregon, and the in his book A Dweller on Two Planets, which was a channeled clairaudient automatically written book that I read 8 times. Probably the only, I'll bet money. I actually will bet $100, Eden, that I'm the only person on earth that's read that book that many times,
Oh,
because it's so crazy what he was saying. And I had searched the whole internet for a year, like somebody surely has broken this book down. Nope, nobody has, because it's,
wow.
people consider it just a crazy, rambling fictional novel. And it's like,
Right.
oh, no, quite the contrary. It has an internal physics, has a theory of the sun that's probably more true than our theory of the sun, has an internal chemistry table, has an internal language that lines up with modern iterations of Basque and the Nahuatl language, which nobody has ever discovered until this book. And it was like the missing piece of the book. And that's why I think I spent like
Wow.
60 pages of the book breaking down what this 17-year-old kid said about Atlantis in 1886. And then Cayce, who had never heard
Right.
of this or read it, ends up confirming so much of what he said.
And
And
what was
then
the name of the book or the young kid?
A Dweller on Two Planets.
A
One of
Dweller on Two
A
Planets?
Dweller on Two Planets by Frederick
Okay.
Spencer Oliver. One of the
Okay.
most
Let's document that
ridiculous
too.
books I've ever read in my life.
Wow.
And it's crazy because, I mean, I've said this many times. If the people that created the Star Wars franchise, if Lucas and friends did not read that, well, then that's even crazier, because the book is the Star Wars franchise.
And apparently that is exactly what our world is. We just don't know it.
Correct.
All right. So let me close with this question for you. In
Mm-hmm.
terms of all of this, where are you spiritually now?
I can never judge, I'm just getting by, doing my thing here, having fun. I think for me, I guess the difference between me now and me 10 years ago is like,
Yeah.
I live as if reincarnation is real. Is it real? Who knows? Probably. But I live as if that is real. And I suppose that's all I can say with any certainty, is that once I started to read, thousands of past life readings from Cayce and all these other channelers, I was like, this just logically makes sense. This isn't even like fantastical. And in fact, I developed my own kind of proof of that, just from an amalgamation of my own philosophical training. And I guess I proved it to myself that it actually has to be true, and that any other, eschatological, like end times or end point, like transition, is just not even philosophically relevant, because to what I say, I always take a chapter from this guy. I'll never forget. I one time was working at a bar, security, and well, I worked there for 10 years actually as a security guard. And one night I had to fight this crazy guy. And
Gosh,
I
another
had,
angle of you. All right, go ahead.
yeah, so there was a crazy guy, drunk, passed out on the dance floor. I've never told this story, so I hope he listens. But he was passed out on the dance floor. I was off duty. He wakes up, starts fighting my friends who are the boss, the bouncer, and everything. And I'm, sitting there, and I'm like, I don't want to watch my friends get beaten up, but I'm not a vigilante. But this went on too long. Anyway, I, grabbed him, choked him, dragged him through the bar, put him on the street, held him down until the police arrested him. And this is a true story. As I was holding him down, he kept saying, "Do you know who I am? Do you know who I am?" I said, "No." Like, it's a great question. Who the hell are you? He said, "I'm a famous professor. You can't do this to me." I said, "I'm a professor too. What are you a professor of?" "Hey, I'm a philosophy professor." "That's pretty weird, man. What the hell are you
Wow.
doing?" And he just gave me the middle finger. Okay. So he goes to jail. Eventually, we go to court. We win the case. He has to pay us damages, and he broke my friend's glasses and everything.
Oh,
Almost lost his job. Almost got deported. He was a Canadian citizen. I won't say his name. You know who you are. And So I just checked it out. Like, who is this guy? And I found out he was a famous, at the time, UC Davis professor, and was on CNN and, high profile, but, after hours, a lunatic. And I read all the books for his class because I knew I was going to meet him in court. And to my great surprise, I found an amazing philosophy book that helped me write this book.
No
And
way.
it was a book called After Finitude by Quentin Meillassoux, who's a chair of the philosophy department at École Normale Supérieure in Paris.
Okay.
And basically, it was one of the craziest things that I've ever read and one of the most difficult books. But basically, his argument was like, we talk ever since we've been able to radiocarbon date things, which he doesn't deny is real. He's like, ever since, the 20s and 30s, we've had this increasing ability to radiocarbon date things. And so we can say with, authority that, in the prehistoric, pre-conscious observer phase of reality, the earth was like this. And basically he proposes a question that even he can't answer, because he's like, when you're talking about a world that has no reference to humanity, like, what really are you talking about? Because the concept of prehistory was created post human emergence of consciousness. Therefore, it contains an internal contradiction that cannot be reconciled. And I was like, that is a profound observation.
Yes.
And it actually, it really applies to so many other things, like death, for example. It's like, well, you've only known life, so what the hell are you talking about? And so for me, that was like a proof of maybe you've just always been here, and we just, like Dolores Cannon said, you forget and you come back and this and that.
Yes.
But I never forget, and actually the other day I looked him up and I sent him an email. I said, hey, remember me, 10 years later? How you doing, professor? And to my great surprise, he said, I do remember that night. I don't remember much. And I said, well, hey, I got to thank you.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah, after I beat your ass, I read your book, from your classes, because I thought we were going to have a chat in court and we didn't get to. And so I just want to thank you. And, here's the book. You can buy it. And, all hard feelings gone. And he's like, oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, thank you for sharing your book. That's funny. I'm doing a lot better now. I'm like, well, that's nice to hear.
That's great.
So there you go. The circle is complete. And there were a lot of incidences like that where things that just seem like out of the blue, like you'd get stuck at a certain chapter, like, man, this isn't making any sense. And I just walk away from the book for, a couple of weeks or a month, and just the weirdest things would pop up. Sometimes it would just be like, I don't know, like I'd be watching a documentary or just talking to people, and I'd be like, wait a minute, and I'd just leave the coffee shop and run home and do the investigation. And so I don't know, I could never do it again. I don't know where this thing came from. People always ask me, when's the next one? I'm like, there is no next one. The next book's gonna be on pirates probably or something like that. But I'm not, I'm done, and I love to talk about it occasionally. I have a couple interviews coming up this month, but I think you have to step away, just like Whitney. If you get immersed in that world for too long, you'll go insane.
It's heavy duty.
You will go insane. Like in her field, 100% you will go insane. You won't trust anybody. And I don't care how strong you are. It's like detectives that have to work in child crimes units. Like they have to take you off after a year because you'll have a nervous breakdown. And so for me, I think, 7 years of this, daily research, it's like a lifetime achievement, and I'm done, I'm done with this field for now, because I don't think there's anything more I could say, because my goal was never to, it was really just to ask questions,
Right.
And although there are some shocking revelations that I have never seen anybody talk about, like a map I found that I've never seen anybody find, and also just conclusions that I've never seen anybody make. It was never my intention to, and no offense against people who do this, but I saw a book recently that was basically like Atlantis found, and here is where it is on Google Maps. It's like, Well, you obviously don't even know what you're talking about, because even by Plato's admission, this was a, you know, multicultural colonial empire spread out across an archipelago. So you're not going to find it. And
It.
also, the geography of this era was totally different because you're excluding this catastrophe. And so you're thinking these places were in the same place, you know. And it was Rudolf Steiner, you know, famous Austrian mystic, who famously said, you'd be just as lucky, or you'd be just as good to look for Atlantis in Montreal or Tennessee than in the mid Atlantic, because of the redistribution of all these continents after the cataclysm that he knew from
Mhm.
his clairvoyance had probably happened. And so, while I do point to certain places like the mid Atlantic ridge, the Azores, where I've seen ample evidence of this, you know, you can also point to places in Yucatan, Mexico, where I could show you where Cayce says these people went, you know, and you could go to Yucatan, Mexico, and see traces of this culture, because it really was a global culture. It was the same world we're living in today, more advanced, good people, evil people, everybody in between, but on a fundamentally higher order of not just technological, but basically, like, it's the world we try to create, but we can
Mhm.
only create fiction.
Mhm.
It's Star Wars, you know, and I don't think that's a coincidental thing. I actually don't think they read A Dweller on Two Planets and really ripped it off. I think they're both talking about a real thing that just comes out in fiction. You know, Tolkien said as much himself. He was a huge proponent of Atlantis, and you know, I don't think there's I don't think it's strange that these are the most popular trilogies of
Exactly.
all time,
Mhm.
probably because we have a, you know, karmic remembrance of them actually taking place. Like, it's really hard to sell something on that scale or make a universe that's that compelling if it does not resonate with an audience, and the thing that resonates with the audience is the truth. So it's like, that
Yes.
would explain why Tolkien and Lord of the Rings and Sauron and all the Emperor and the Sith and the Jedi, it's like, because it was probably real.
Yes, and I
And
believe that a lot of that is real and it's put out
yeah,
as movies and fiction and entertainment. So we go, "Oh, that's not
100%,
real." But yeah, there's so much more
100%.
truth to it. All right, so closing up, I would say then that now you believe in a lot more and in
Yeah,
possibilities. And like I feel,
yeah,
and I'm so excited. I'm so excited for you and I'm so excited for you sharing all of this with us and your um it feels like
a
a
lot more I
different.
can't talk about.
Oh gosh. Oh gosh. Maybe we do a part two. It feels like there was your awakening and then another awakening, but it just feels like you have, okay, here's an interesting word. You've blossomed into this. What's next? I am really open right now to what
Mm,
I might discover, what I might feel, the
that's right.
magic.
That's
Is
right.
that fair to say?
Yeah, you know, it's really interesting because it's almost like, and I'm not even trying to sound, you know, arrogant, but I was looking at something I wrote in a Word document,
Hmm.
um, on March, no, I'm sorry, April 1st, 2020.
Hmm.
And I had intended to publish it in New Dawn magazine, which I write for, but I was like, you know what? No, I'm going to just keep this for myself and look at it again in 3 years. And almost like, it scares me because what I said was going to happen, it actually happened. And it happened on a level that is not just like a good guess. You know, I said they're going to do this, they're going to do that, and then you're going to do this, and they're going to counter with this, and then they're going to do this, and this country's going to do this, and then when that country does this country's going to
Mm.
do this, and it was almost exactly the timeline that happened. And so I'm kind of just like, you know, one of the reasons I came here is because nobody here gives a damn about any of that. And I love the fact that the Mexican
That's
people are like, basically, you know, I mean, look, when it was at the quote unquote height of all this BS, there were a handful of places that were like, hey, you know, just, you know, please, you know, but I was almost happy to do it because I knew the people were also just kind of like, look, we all know this is BS, but in Chicago, I had a guy basically tell me, if you don't put that on in 7-Eleven, I'm gonna kill you. Like, and he was a crazy, like, ex-military guy. And at that point, I'm like, it's a threat to my, not
right.
just well-being, but like my physical well-being. Like these
Hmm.
people are insane, and
And
they're
Chicago was a tough place to be. Like that's one of the,
already
and
a
yeah.
crazy town before this.
Hmm.
It's like 50 people got murdered the day I left to come to Mexico.
Okay. And
And
so
I asked,
that is interesting because I don't know. So in Mexico, it's not dominant there at all.
no, and in
Oh,
fact, it
that's
was the
so
only
nice.
country I could emigrate to that did not require a vaccination card at that time. I think it was, no, you know what? I take it back. It was like Tanzania, Bosnia, or Mexico.
No way.
Yeah, no, I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. I couldn't go to Canada. I
Oh
couldn't go
no,
anywhere.
not Canada.
No, I couldn't go anywhere. And even interstate travel, I couldn't do with an airplane,
Hmm.
you know? And
Hmm.
so I was just like, I'm done with this. I'm done with this. And it's been so funny because I still have my friends from Chicago who, my friend who's a doorman, he ended up getting a job as a production manager for a music venue.
Oh my
And
gosh.
he's still texting me to this day, Eden, like, look at this. And I mean, 3 years later, these people are still texting him like, so we, at this event we just need you to make sure that you sanitize everything and you show your PCR test. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, this is
Hmm.
still a thing.
Hmm.
Like, I can't believe you people. And he basically told me, he's like, I don't think it's ever going back. Like, the damage is irreparable at this point, because for those people to admit that they were duped on a
Yeah.
scale that is unprecedented in
Yep.
humanity. I mean, in recorded history, maybe something like this happened in Atlantis, but it's like, at least as far as I know,
Right.
there's never been a con like this. And so that would basically
That's
almost
going to
be
be
like
hard.
more dangerous for them
Hmm.
and us if the universe like wanted to do what everybody in this community is always talking about, like, why can't they wake up? It's like, well, be careful what you wish for, because could you
Hmm.
imagine if billions of people suddenly realized they were duped? Like, that's not really productive either, because then
Hmm.
you're talking about like Mad Max when they go and kill everybody that wanted to do this to them,
Yes.
or kill us for not telling. Who knows? I mean,
Right.
I kind of think I have the mentality now, to answer your question, where it's like, I just played dumb. People ask me, I used to live in the mountains here at a climbing resort, and I'd meet all these crazy people that would come from Canada, and
Yeah.
oh, you live here, like, and I would, because I guess I look Hispanic, even though I'm French and black, but people would think like, and so I would just say like, oh, like, no, no, I don't speak English, like, I don't. Like, what do you do? Oh, this guy doesn't speak English. And I tell my friends, if they talk to me about this, you tell them I don't speak English. And my friend from Germany would be like, oh, he doesn't speak English. And I'd be like, oh, like, ¿qué pasó? Because it's like, if you want me to break out into like a 10-hour debate on the World Economic Forum, like, you're not gonna like it, man.
Mhm.
You're not gonna
I
like it.
know.
So don't ask me about that. Because I've already lost, a girlfriend over this issue, who, I really loved, and that was like a really painful realization of like, no, I really can't continue to pretend that doesn't bother me,
Yeah.
that you can't look at this for what it is. Like, you can sit here all day and see the same thing and use just basic 101 kindergarten logic, like, why are we sitting down and we don't need a mask, but we're standing up, and like, it
Right.
insulted her because
Or we can take it off to eat and then we have to put it
she
back on.
knew deep down it was BS,
Yeah.
but she had invested in it because she had lived in New York, and so all her
Mm.
friends and this, and it's like, I just really lost respect for a lot of people during this, because I was like, look, I lost everything twice, okay, and I could have put that mask on. They gave me 5 chances, and you know what I did every time? I gave Katie the middle finger in front of the entire staff and said, why don't you read the Constitution, okay? Why don't you read a book instead of just being a little Gestapo agent? And that was when the heavies came in, and the police and the cops, and you're on a Skype call with the district attorney, circuit judge, and I'm like, F all of you people, okay? Like, my grandfather fought the Nazis, okay, so that I didn't have to live through it again, okay? And if you actually knew anything about history, you would sit down for a minute. But instead, you just want to go ahead with this, like, well, there's a mandate from the mayor. And I'm like, these aren't even laws,
Right.
like you don't even know the law and you're a judge. Like, shame on you. Shame on all of you people, basically. And also F you. And I'm getting on the airplane and I'm out, because it was just, it was crazy. And it wasn't just me. I saw so many other people in other places. And I made, friends with a guy, Brendan Murphy, who, I mean, he had to flee with his family from Australia. And he came to Mexico too. And that's
Yes.
how we met, through New Dawn
Oh,
magazine. We both published the same article about escaping the COVID communism, and that's how the
right.
editor put us together. He's like, Michael, you don't know anybody down there. Brendan doesn't know anybody. You guys should become friends.
Oh, no
And so,
kidding.
yeah, and he basically had to restart his entire life. He had never been here. He didn't speak Spanish, and so, I mean, that's a lot harder than I had to do. He had a newborn baby and a job, and his family was there,
Well, and
extended
coming
family.
from Australia, I bet even getting
Right.
out was
Even
challenging.
getting out was like the final straw. And then Max Egan had to escape Australia because the police were coming to his house for his videos. And now he's running a really cool bar in Acapulco, and it's like we all got out of the respective empires
Hmm.
and came to these places. And, I almost, people ask me, like, you know, do you want to go back, when this is over? I'm like, when this is over, like, we're just
Right.
getting started, bro. Like, are you kidding? When this is over,
Hmm.
like, what are you talking about? And even if it was, even if it were over, it's like, no, I'm not forgiving these people. Why? Why would I do that? Like, these people need to learn that their actions have consequences, and they need to lose everything if that means growing as, a being here on Earth, because not all lessons are easy, and a lot of people in, I don't even like to say my side because I don't like to take sides, but it's like a lot of us have suffered greatly and
Yeah.
and didn't really complain about it. Just like, okay, well, one day you'll see that we're right. And it's like, yeah, you're crazy. Well, okay. Don't ever ask me a question about it now going forward. All those people I don't talk to anymore. Wait, what is this thing you said 3 years ago? It's like,
Yeah.
too late, man. You had the chance. I tried to tell you in the hallway, like, too bad. Like, that was your choice. You got three of those things. Go right ahead. Like, I don't
Right.
know what's in there. Nobody knows. Who the hell knows? Albert Bourla doesn't know what the hell's in there. He's just cashing the check. It's like Kool-Aid, or, who knows what the hell's in there? Rat poison? Like, God only knows, but you got it. So you'll find out soon enough. And I wish you the best. And I truly hope that nothing happens, that you got, a good batch, or you got saline or something else. But chances are you didn't. And
Hmm.
chances are you will suffer down the line on some level that I will not. And so I'm sorry, that's just the way it is. And like, that's your lesson this round of the Earth game. I guess.
This
Sorry.
round of the Earth game. Okay, well,
Yeah.
I so appreciate you talking about that. I appreciate
Thank you.
your standing up for what I believe. Again, not to get into the right and wrong, but standing up for you and standing
That's
up
right.
for your autonomy, your authenticity, the Constitution, all of that. So good for you. Again, I'm going to go ahead and close this out. This man, support this man. He is he's done this beautiful book that is very intellectual and researched and showing to the world again that there's so much more going on. Like working for Whitney, there's so much going on in the world on a human aspect, and
Mm,
this just opens the door to more, because there is more, everybody, and everybody that listens to this show knows there is. So Michael, thank
that's
you
right.
so much for lending
Oh, thank you.
yourself here, your honesty, everything. And if you can hang out with me for just a second after we're done recording. Is there anything else you want to say to sign off?
No, I just like to thank you again for hosting me. And also, it's so great that I think things like this, these kinds of conversations, it's what gave me, it's probably the only thing that kept me from going actually insane,
Yeah.
was the first couple times, in the middle of 2020, that I heard a handful of people having basic conversations like this, saying like, you know what's going on, right? Okay, like, I'm not crazy. And so I
Right.
think, if you can give people just a little bit of hope like this on any kind of topic, it's a nice thing, because I always think it's like, the funniest thing is, and people have critiqued me for this, but I think this is one of the best things that's ever happened.
I would agree.
And it's just a hard pill that we had to do and hard to take. But would you rather live in the world that was, where all this was still going on, but, under complete wraps? Or
Mm-hmm.
would you rather see it for what it is and then maybe change it? So I'm actually glad. I would never want to go back to the, dream I was living in 2015 or whatever. Oh, this is great. Everything's going to be great. It's like, well, as you're doing that, they're preparing something else. So maybe you should get ready.
Get ready, man.
Yeah.
All
So I
right.
think it's great, that you're doing this and connecting people, because at the end of the day, that's all you can do.
I know, and to be with people
your
who do see and understand more. And again, knowing that we right now are the smaller faction, but it's going to get bigger and better. And
I think
just,
so.
yeah, I think so too. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Peace out.
Peace out.
Just be practice.
Hey, sunshiny people. All right. The practice is going to be a little bit different this time. I thought I would go ahead and share this interview that Russell Brand did with Whitney Webb. It's just great. And it's only 15 minutes. And she, again, substantiates that there's so much going on here with Epstein. And I think on Glenn Beck, she talked about transhumanism and all that stuff. And she has documentation for all of it. I mean, it is real, just like with Michael talking about Atlantis through all of his documentation. It is real. All right. Enjoy. Yay.
Stay free with Russell Brand. See it first on Rumble. Whitney, I've been watching some of your interviews, and I've got to say, it's one of those, the area of your research and expertise is one of those areas that's actually almost scary to talk about, because we on this show are continually talking about hypocrisy, corruption, the deep state, democracy being a kind of hollow and theatrical affair where real power is beyond the reach of ordinary people. We sort of infer sometimes that people may get assassinated because their interests and the stories that they tell are at odds with the agenda of powerful people. But how much proof you appear to have and your willingness to talk about it is somewhat staggering. So I guess let's to start with Jeffrey Epstein and his ties to incredibly powerful global figures, former President Bill Clinton and one of the world's most powerful tycoons, Bill Gates. Can you just sort of unpack for us the nature of these relationships, which have sort of, while people are peripherally aware of it, it seems to be something that's somehow been submerged and lost?
Sure. So if you look at the mainstream narrative about Epstein, no one in mainstream media wants to talk about Jeffrey Epstein and what he was doing before the year 2000. So if you look at the timeline with Epstein and Bill Clinton, for example, what you see is that from 1987 till roughly 1993, Jeffrey Epstein was one of the masterminds of one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in U.S. history. And financial criminality is consistent throughout his career. When that was being prosecuted, Jeffrey Epstein's name was dropped from the case in 1993, and that same year he appears at Clinton fundraisers, some of the most controversial fundraisers of the entire Clinton administration. For example, in 1993, it was a fundraiser associated with the White House Historical Association being nominally run by the office of Hillary Clinton. It makes an appearance in Vince Foster's alleged suicide note, who was the White House counsel that died under very suspicious circumstances. And then Epstein was involved in, roughly after that, 15 visits to the White House in less than a 2-year span with a man named Mark Middleton, who... Well, most of them were with Mark Middleton, who was a central figure in the 1996 campaign finance scandal, also known as Chinagate in some circles. And essentially there you have Epstein being involved in a massive way with those financial tricks, I guess you could say, for lack of a better word. And at the same time, he's involved in relocating Southern Air Transport, the CIA-linked airline involved in Iran-Contra, from its headquarters in Miami, Florida, to Ohio to ostensibly run cargo for Leslie Wexner's enterprises, where they'll be going from Columbus to Hong Kong, which interestingly enough was a major hub for a lot of this corruption in 1996 involving Mark Middleton, who Epstein's meeting with at the same time. Subsequently after this, which is the only time where mainstream media starts to talk about the Clinton-Epstein relationship, Clinton is out of office and setting up the Clinton Foundation. And a lot of the setup for the Clinton Foundation he is doing while flying on Jeffrey Epstein's plane, specifically the Africa trip, but also the Asia trip. And things out of this that come out of this are things like the Clinton Health Access Initiative, with later partners with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in very significant ways. So essentially what you have there is, considering that the Clinton Foundation's sort of been treated as a political slush fund of the Clinton family, you have Jeffrey Epstein over a period of decades being involved in essentially guiding the most suspect financial activity of the Clinton family from the early 90s onward, and including their rebranding of their, political cronyism as philanthropy. I'll pause before getting into Bill Gates, because that's a totally different story.
I mean, yeah, this is before we've got to Bill Gates. I mean, I didn't know that Epstein's skullduggery went all the way back to Iran-Contra. It seems like wherever there's corruption, Jeffrey Epstein was there, like a kind of Forrest Gump of global corruption. Like, so is it then that even before you get to the salacious sexual rage, trafficking, abuse side of the Jeffrey Epstein story, there's mammoth financial corruption and the involvement of significant political and corporate figures?
Yeah, the financial criminality aspect of Epstein's career spans essentially from the late 70s all the way up until his second arrest in 2019. Whereas the crimes, as far as we know, span sometime between 1991 and up until his first arrest around 2006, 2007 or so, at least the bulk of those crimes that we know about.
And what is the nature of the connection with Bill Gates? Now that you've done the first Bill, let's move on to the second.
Right. So if you believe mainstream media, Bill Gates and Jeffrey Epstein didn't meet until 2011, but that is unfortunately for Bill Gates contradicted by evidence that's actually in mainstream media. So for example, the Evening Standard, a pretty mainstream outlet in the United Kingdom, has an article from, I believe, January 2001, where it's talking about Ghislaine Maxwell and her relationship with Prince Andrew, and discusses Jeffrey Epstein introducing him to a UK audience. There it introduces him as a property developer and says that he made most of his millions through his business links to three individuals: Leslie Wexner, Donald Trump, and the third one is Bill Gates. So why would the Evening Standard name Bill Gates as one of the main business partners of Jeffrey Epstein during the 1990s if they didn't meet until roughly a decade later? No one in mainstream media has been interested in following that up with me, even though I've been contacted by outlets such as the BBC for that information, and then, never goes anywhere. And even beyond that, if you're looking at some other aspects of the Epstein-Gates relationship, you have a woman named Melanie Walker come along, who was allegedly recruited by Jeffrey Epstein to be a Victoria's Secret model in 1992. There's no evidence she ever modeled, but she became Epstein's science advisor in the late 90s, and shortly thereafter became science advisor to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. If you're Bill Gates and you're hiring a science advisor for your relatively new foundation, and you're looking at her CV, and all it really has is a science advisor to Jeffrey Epstein, you would have to know who Jeffrey Epstein is and what kind of science he was into. And this again is well before the 2011 date we're alleged to believe is when they first met. And I would argue that this isn't so much to protect Bill Gates, it's about protecting Microsoft, because Epstein in the 1990s, as well as the Maxwell family, extensively involved in the activities of Microsoft to a very significant, it's just very extreme. And Ghislaine Maxwell herself was involved in some of those business connections as well at a time when she was involved with Epstein. Epstein was also involved in a very suspicious trip, a delegation Microsoft sent to Russia in 1998, where he's touring local high schools in Russia with Microsoft executives. Some of those executives, like Nathan Myhrvold, later are allegedly tied to his trafficking operations and named by prominent Epstein victims as their abusers. And you also have Microsoft executives like Linda Stone also being in the mix there as well. So there's several executives. And Melanie Walker, who I just mentioned, ended up dating a top Microsoft executive in the early 2000s as well. Sorry.
Not at all, Whitney. The aspect of these crimes is, of course, independently heinous enough and exploitative in a manner that's almost difficult to conceive of in terms of its scale and scope and geographical reach and the number of people involved. But it appears that this is also merely one component, and in fact is an aspect of this is the use of this criminal activity in order to create ties that are connected to power. Am I correct? And where is it, Whitney, that all of this is going? Because it seems to me that you're handling a great deal of information and a great deal of energy, and that you have a sense yourself that you're very close to how global power really operates.
Well, that was my whole effort of the book. I wrote 1,000 pages. It's 2 volumes. The second volume focuses on Epstein, and the first volume focuses on how this happened and how this network that enabled Epstein essentially came into existence. And what I'm trying to do there is really just interrogate the power structures that are essentially running most of the Western world, and of course the Western world, particularly U.S. empire, has client states around the world. In other words, this would be the power structure of most of the world today. And essentially what you have are major elements of organized crime and intelligence agencies, mainly in the U.S., U.K., and Israel, that essentially fused during, the World War II and the immediate post-World War era. And a lot of really crazy things have gone on. And essentially what I found is that history is littered with figures just like Jeffrey Epstein. He was not an anomaly at all, like we've been told by mainstream media. And thus, it's probably likely that people swimming in these elite circles for several decades, found this type of activity in which Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were engaged to be perfectly normal. And actually, there's reports in 2003, and I think the Evening Standard and other UK outlets that openly talk about Ghislaine Maxwell training young blonde girls in techniques and brandishing whips at parties. People knew about this well before Epstein was arrested the first time, and nothing was done. And you even have the wife of the deceased Senator John McCain in the United States, Cindy McCain, saying in early January 2020, we all knew what he was doing, talking about Epstein. So this was known and nothing was done.
It's extraordinary. So it seems like it would be impossible to have a significant connection to Jeffrey Epstein and not know what he was doing. Overtly and explicitly, Jeffrey Epstein then is a realtor, a fixer, a global playboy. But the nature of his connections means what? That he's integrally involved in the true structures of power that are usually concealed from ordinary people.
Yeah, to an extent. I think he was really sort of a middle management figure who was sort of linking top tiers of this power structure and with people on the ground actually enacting a lot of these operations, policies, and corrupt acts, and of course him himself being intimately involved in several acts of corruption. As well. And ultimately, I think the reason the financial crimes are not discussed is because that's getting to the bottom of a lot of things that are still ongoing to this very day. And there's a lot of powerful interests that definitely don't want that coming out. And if you look at, for example, when efforts have been made to investigate the tie of Epstein and Wall Street banks, most recently with this situation in the Virgin Islands, the Attorney General was fired after trying to file suit against Deutsche Bank, I believe, for their relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. And the previous attempt to prosecute that in a U.S. court saw the judge's son assassinated, essentially, by someone that had previously worked for an intelligence-linked outfit called Kroll Associates. So there's a whole lot of crazy stuff there. And so why was I think it's pretty clear why the mainstream media won't touch this one if that's how it happened, that's how it's played out on the legal side.
I suppose we all have a sense that there are elite and inaccessible organizations that primarily are connected around the administration of power, the acquisition of profit, the manipulation of the media agenda, the top American political figures, significant corporate figures across the globe, some of the world's most powerful billionaires have connections and relationships that are illicit. And of course, the nature of this story suggests that there is a component, that's a significant part of it. One of the other aspects of this is that I keep hearing people connected to this story die in mysterious circumstances. And then, of course, Jeffrey Epstein's death in custody doesn't seem to be entirely straightforward. What's your impression there, Whitney?
Of Epstein's death, I definitely think the official story is totally insane and very difficult to believe. And essentially, it's very hard to know what happened that day because the guards were asleep, the cameras didn't work, and all these different things, went wrong. And it's just a very difficult story to believe, especially if you believe the official story of how he allegedly hung himself after being on suicide watch with paper-thin sheets. And he's a tall guy. A lot of it doesn't really add up. And ultimately, if you look at other people in the Epstein case, for example, Mark Middleton, who I mentioned earlier, who was frequently meeting with Epstein at the White House around 94 and 1995, in May of last year, he was found hanging by the neck by an extension cord and a shotgun blast to the chest. A couple months after the Daily Mail published the visitor logs between him and Epstein and revealed that what was thought to be 5 visits was really closer to 17. And the local Arkansas court blocked all media and all files related to Middleton's death from being released, and it was ruled a suicide. So you tell me how likely it is that someone hung themselves and at the same time they shot themselves in the chest with a shotgun, and how likely that was actually a suicide, as authorities maintain.
Occasionally, these stories occur that reveal the true nature of power, and it makes me a bit scared, to tell you the truth, Whitney. Do you sometimes feel like, hold on a minute, if I keep talking about this stuff on the internet and write books about it, it's pretty clear that I'm in some risks? Do you ever feel that, mate?
So there's the network I trace in the book has been reported by previous journalists who had things happen to them, like Gary Webb and Danny Casolaro. But I think today the media, the powers that be, are more likely to paint me as just a conspiracy theorist and ignore me than go to all the effort of coming all the way to South America and executing some sort of hit or something like that. And ultimately, I feel that if you live in fear of these people, you're giving them power over you and power over your life. And if your goal is to free yourself and your family and ultimately the world from this type of corrupt power establishment, we should not be giving them power over us. So that's how I feel personally about it.
Stay free with Russell Brand. See it first on Rumble.
So cool of you to be here. I went from being off most social media to being on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Truth Social, and you might be watching this on YouTube, Rumble, or BitChute. Or you might be listening to this on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. I'm on over 19 directories at this point. So connect, comment, subscribe, like. Oh, and my intention is to have a new episode out Wednesday of each week. Oh, Lordy, more to come.